Welcome to Chapter 19, Civilization's Inferno, the Rise and Form of Industrial Cities, from 1880 to 1917. Let's get started, but look at that photograph. And that was obviously a black and white photograph that was colored in. I don't remember the name of that process. To kind of give you a little look at how things looked, that was a street in New York City. I believe it might have been Bleecker Street. I'm not too sure. But I saw that photo and I thought that was a good one to put on the front. Take some time to look at that. Look at the detail there. Look at the folks there. So the new metropolis. The shape of this new industrial city. And a lot of these industrial cities are still around in different forms, but let's see how they came to be. Steam engines will replace water power in cities. That's going to be a huge innovation because you're going to start seeing cities rise in other areas than near swift-flowing rivers, which gave power to factories. You're going to start seeing cities more in the inland, not necessarily on the water. That's really important. With that, in these cities, you have mass transit of trolley cars, elevated railroads, and subways emerged in large cities. Trolley cars, probably a bad example, San Francisco. There were actually trolley cars in Providence that went into Seekonk. Rhode Island trolley cars from Pawtucket that also went into Baker's Corner in the North End, and then over near the Exxon station and where Labonte's Auto School there, in the South End, which would be County Street and Fall River Avenue. Elevated railroads, think Chicago, where you had quite a bit of that. And then subways, the first subway station was in Boston, Massachusetts, which is the Park Street subway station, the Green Line, and also New York City with subways. So transportation within these areas will be by rail, local rail. Other things that shaped the industrial city is skyscrapers. First appeared in Chicago. The Chicago School led by Louis Sullivan, and there is Louis Sullivan there on the right. The reason you could do skyscrapers is because of steel. Remember Carnegie and steel. Because of steel now you can go up. And it has the strength, durability, and eventually the affordability to do that. It allowed landowners to make money on small plots of land by building up. When you look at places like New York and Boston, you look up. The electric city, where electricity emerged in cities in the later 19th century. It'll take a while for it to get outside the city and into the rural areas, but electricity is going to be unbelievably transformational, not only from an economic standpoint, but from a cultural standpoint. I don't know how many of you guys go to cities in the evening. They're so much different than the city during the day. I mean, we know a real popular thing now is the water fire. How things look in the evening with light. Well, electric light is going to change the whole landscape of cities. You can see that there also for security or against crime, a light as good as a policeman. Newcomers and neighbors. Men and women moved to cities from rural areas for financial opportunities. Some, they just wanted to get away from the rural life. It isn't just financial, it was eventually be cultural. That's more probably later in the 20th century, just for adventure, to leave the, lack of a better term, boring life in the rural areas for some. But mostly financial opportunities, and not even just opportunities, financial necessity. We'll have plenty of conversations that the farmer wasn't exactly doing so hot in a lot of areas with Western expansion. So again, with industrialization, cities would give those opportunities. Immigrants often lived in the same communities. This is known as ethnic clustering. It still exists today. Boston's a great example. Still, South Boston, a lot of the older Irish families is still there. North end of Boston, Italian. East Boston has changed. Now it's more Latino, um, Dorchester, and Roxbury, African American. So racial, ethnic clustering. Your Italian neighborhoods, your Irish neighborhoods, your Polish neighborhoods. A lot of times, the center of that neighborhood would be a church and stores and other kinds of things. Many of these institutions served ethnic communities, would be newspapers, singing societies, an example, Yiddish theater or types of ethnic theaters, etc. African Americans will soon be moving to cities more so after World War I, but a little bit beforehand. Virtually all faced discrimination, and few jobs were available for African Americans. Later on, we'll look at some flourishing communities like Harlem and the south side of Chicago. Many African Americans have become porters and domestic servants. There will be race riots, attacks on African Americans by white mobs in cities. It happened during the Civil War in New York, during the draft riots. It's going to happen later also. And you can see a French paper on the right there showing a lynching and that kind of stuff in the United States. In Atlanta in 1906, 24 blacks were killed in the city of Atlanta. That is a cool picture, I think. I guess everybody's doing laundry. Tenement houses or dumbbell tenements. There were 5 to 6 story cramped apartments and many families sharing few rooms. I would say that those buildings were jam-packed. And you can see with all the clothes being put out in the middle there for drying outside the window. Some city cultures like urban amusements, the vaudeville theater, music, skits, and magic shows. Nickelodeons are going to start. These 5-cent movie theaters. The motion picture is going to come to be, obviously, silent films. And the reason they call them Nickelodeons because they cost 5 cents. Amusement parks. Coney Island, New York, for instance, inspired other amusement parks throughout the country. In this area, you had Crescent Park in Riverside. The carousel's still there. Where the park used to be now are condominiums. You had Lincoln Park in Westport. That's long gone. You had Rocky Point that will emerge in Warwick. Revere had an amusement park. Amusement parks were a big deal throughout the country. Roller coasters and the whole 9 yards. Music, ragtime, and city blues. Ragtime was popular among all classes and races. And ragtime is the foundation of blues, which is going to be the foundation eventually of rock music and rock and roll. Ragtime was introduced at Chicago's World Fair in 1893. Song Devil in the White City by Eric Larson. I'll have to find a recording of that. Obviously not an original, so we can hear that. Blues appealed to individuals in cities and spoke of handwork and heartache. Blues, it didn't originate necessarily in the cities, but appealed to people in the cities. More on city cultures, high culture. The rich helped promote museums, and some believe some out of the sense of duty. Gospel of Wealth by Andrew Carnegie, and how he viewed what to do with your wealth is to give it back to the community where people can help themselves or learn about our world amongst us. He helped create over 1,000 libraries across the nation. And that Gospel of Wealth, we'll definitely look at that. Let me go back there. There's one of the original Carnegie libraries. Not too sure what city. That might be New York. Urban journalism, or yellow journalism, is sensationalizing and exaggerating news stories in order to sell newspapers. Well, that really hasn't changed. Sensationalizing and exaggerating television news stories in order to get ratings. It really hasn't changed. There's always going to be that factor within journalism, and you can make the argument that's most of journalism today. Yellow journalism is going to be a major cause of the Spanish-American War. It's going to get public opinion really riled up to go to war with Spain. And if you're looking for a good book on journalism, Murder of the Century by Paul Collins, definitely take a look at that. The muckrakers. It was a term coined by Teddy Roosevelt to describe the journalists that expose corruption and problems of society. They're basically raking the mud. Muck is, mud with dirt and who knows what else. A book called The Shame of the Cities by Lincoln Steffens is definitely one of the most famous, or the most famous, muckraker type of book. Wrote about the corruption between municipal and city governments and big business. Has that really changed? Depends. Urban machines. Many utilities were provided by private businesses, not the city government. And these political machines are going to be organized. Good example is Tammany Hall in New York City. The reason they called it Tammany Hall faction, where they met, was a place called Tammany Hall. It controlled many aspects of city government, provided jobs, food, money, etc. to constituents, that's people that live there, in exchange for votes and support. Tammany would welcome immigrants into the country, knowing in time they'll become voters. They took care of them. They might have helped them gave them some soup when they got off the boat, helped feed them, helped them find jobs and housing, and because of that, get their loyalty and votes. There's a book by George Washington Plunkett. He's a leader of Tammany Hall, and he favored what's called honest graft. What is graft? Getting kickbacks or money from developers who got city contracts, and you kind of make money that way. He said there's honest ways of doing that, and then there's dishonest ways of doing that. We'll look at some excerpts from our friend George Washington Plunkett. Then there's William Boss Tweed. He favored dishonest graft, bribery, stole over $200 million and later got caught in Cuba due to a political cartoonist named Thomas Nast. I'll show you some stuff from Nast. There we are. There's George Washington Plunkett, and then there is a Thomas Nast cartoon of Boss Tweed, and you see that basically his head and who he is a bag of money. So, limits of machine government. Mayors, like Mayor Quincy in Boston, began to build public schools, gyms, playgrounds, and other spaces. He also fought to lower fares on streetcars. There's Quincy. But then there's going to be another guy on the right. His name is James Michael Curley. He's going to be a little bit different. He's going to be a little bit more on the corrupt side. He would build the public schools, gyms, playgrounds, on the spaces, but he would make sure that he and his friends got a little bit of the action kicked back to them. Campaign contributions. Back then, you can use campaign contributions wherever you wanted. There was no limits, and you get bags of cash and all that kind of stuff. So the crucibles of progressive reform. Fighting Dirt and Vice, How the Other Half Lives by Jacob Riis. There's Jacob Riis on the right. He helped expose plight of the poor in tenement houses. With that, how the other half lives, Jacob Riis was brought around by the New York City Police Commissioner. At that time, the New York City Police Commissioner was one Theodore Roosevelt, who eventually became president. Cleaning up urban environments, disease spread through cities quickly, like cholera, typhoid fever. And what one of the biggest problems they figured out with it was the water wasn't clean. So there'll be clean water initiatives to have waterworks in cities to be able to provide clean and potable, Potable, that means drinkable or usable with food, clean and potable water for citizens. So these new sewage and drainage systems were established in large cities. Because what happened, guys, is that you had drainage that would end up in the water supply. You have to separate your water supply from sewage and drainage systems. So you don't want drainage from the streets going into your water supply. And even worse, sewage that's not really moved around too much ending up in your water supply. I think we'd all agree that's pretty nasty and can kill you. The City Beautiful movement sought to increase and improve the number of park spaces. It's great to have all these big buildings and places where people live, but you need to have open space. So one of the grandest example of the City Beautiful movement was Central Park in New York. I don't know if any of you have ever been there. It's a stunning place. Also in cities was get rid of these red light districts, and red light districts is where you have pornography, prostitutes, and that kind of stuff. And these were reasons that women entered prostitution, was because they had low-paying jobs, hard economic times, abuse, etc. So in the cities, they're trying to get rid of the business of prostitution. Those areas are called red light districts. The Mann Act made it illegal to transport prostitutes across state lines. This was put together to try to stop and find any way to be able to stop prostitution at a federal level. So some of the crucibles of progressive reform: the movement for social settlements. You have the Hull House in Chicago with Jane Addams, founded in 1889, helped poor women, immigrants, and children adjust to city life. Provided a bathhouse. Again, you didn't have running water in apartments. You went to a place called a bathhouse to take a bath and wash yourself. Also provided daycare so parents can work, etc. Inspired other settlement houses throughout the country. It became instrumental in social work and the progressive movement. That through scientific management and looking at the problems in society can make things better. And one of the things that the social settlement movement looked at was immigrants coming to the country, being able to read and write English, have support, be able to keep themselves clean with bathhouses and stuff, and trying to alleviate some of these situations that late 19th century poverty would bring to people. Then you have Margaret Sanger. I think I mentioned her in the last chapter. She advocated birth control. It was illegal in many areas of the time. But the one thing, again, I just have a problem with Margaret Sanger because she bought into eugenics. It is known that one of the main reasons she supported birth control was to keep the black population down. That kind of stuff doesn't fly with me. Cities and national politics. Upton Sinclair, his essay or book called The Jungle in 1906. It helped inspire the Meat Inspection Act and Pure Food and Drug Act. But we're going to find Upton Sinclair's motivation was not to get meat inspection per se and Pure Food and Drug Act inspection to have our food and our drugs and labeling and truth and labeling. He was more concerned about the workers. He wrote The Jungle to show the conditions of the workers and try to stick up for the workers. But that's not how it was taken. The action from The Jungle was specifically about the food supply being contaminated and the kind of disgusting things spoken about or written about, not spoken about there, and then also how that's going to evolve to truth in labeling. You'll say, oh yeah, you drink this, you'll get rid of cancer. Well, okay, truth in labeling. You can't just say things, and that's what they were doing on labels. They'll say these certain products would do certain things. No. So, the National Consumer League, the NCL, led by Florence Kelly, advocated laws to protect workers. And where this really is going to change was safety, building safety, and fire safety is the awful Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire on March 25th, 1911, where 146 employees died. The average age of these women, mostly all women, was 19 years old. So the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory girls, and there were no fire escapes. Alfred Smith was a New York legislator at the time and future presidential candidate. He established a commission to investigate the disaster. The doors were locked. There was no access for these women to get out. They were on the top floor. And a good amount of them had the choice, either burn to death or jump. And a lot of them jumped. Absolutely horrific. It's going to lead to a whole bunch of stuff, fire safety in particular. It helped inspire a lot of new laws. More on city and national politics. Frances Perkins saw that fire from Columbia University. She worked there. She became the first woman appointed to a presidential cabinet. In that book there, Triangle, The Fire That Changed America, very, very good. I haven't read all of it. I've read parts of it. If you're into something, you look at this fire, how it changed, what government will do, state and federal government, for safety, workplace safety, unionism, where unions were always talking about, leading up to this, safety for workers, and it unfortunately took a horrific tragedy like this to really get government off its butt to regulate in terms of safety. Now, we all know government can get out of control, but obviously the response to Triangle would not be that case. So, quick recap for Chapter 19. The tenement houses and how the other half lived with Jacob Riis. A lot of photos. I'll get us to look at some of the photos from that. They're pretty descriptive. A lot of them you've probably seen before. Immigrants lived in their similar communities, ethnic clusters or ethnic neighborhoods. You look at cities, folks from different parts of the world want to be in the same place among folks that they know. It's not a bad thing. I think it makes communities really, really strong. So, yellow journalism that caused the Spanish-American War. Understand that the newspaper business was competitive and they wanted to sell newspapers, so get people all riled up to buy the next paper. They do the same thing, guys, now for news, cable news networks, and trying to get people to watch. So the muckrakers, think about, putting people into the mud and exposing the corruption and the ugly part of politics in particular. These political machines, we're going to spend a little bit more time on this with Boss Tweed and discuss this a little bit more. It's very easy to say, hey, the machines were corrupt and they were terrible, but when you look at some of these ethnic political machines, like in Boston with Jim Curley, in other cities, Frank Hague, who was in Jersey City, New Jersey, you'll see how these evolve. The settlement house movement with Jane Addams as the biggest example. The jungle and its effects on food safety and drug truth and labeling. Frances Perkins and her role that's going to be in labor, and what's going to shape her viewpoint is her experience of seeing that Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. And that's pretty much it for Chapter 19. And remember, guys, we're not always going to cover every single thing. So if you do have questions, what you read in Chapter 19, in class, you definitely need to ask those questions. Because if you probably have a question, there's a good chance other classmates will too. And I'll make sure that I elicit those questions. So make sure you're taking notes. And if there's gaps there, you need to be asking that. Until next time, thanks for watching.